Hello, my name is Patricia Hatna. I am a junior, and the subject I chose to talk about is freedom schools in the 60s. Freedom schools in the 60s was my chosen topic for my final because reading about freedom schools and finding out about freedom schools is very impactful when it came to black education now and back in the day. It really showed that black scholars were willing to do anything, no matter who is in their way, to get the proper education that they needed. Their stories are so inspiring and important to black education and black scholars now. After the desegregation laws passed, many schools in the South did not react well to them. Instead of opening their schools up to black students as they were requested to do, many of them simply closed and taught their white students at home. This was supposed to last a summer, which why it was referred to as the Freedom Summer by a lot of black civil rights activists. But it ended up lasting 2 to 5 years in the South. In Mississippi, Virginia, and other parts of the South, the education system was simply not working. Declared by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1964, the Freedom Summer in Mississippi started and it continued on for years. The black and white picture below is what is referred to as a freedom school. It was just a simple house where many children met up. Because the schools were closed, many poor white children and black children weren't getting the education that they needed. So the United Federation of Teachers in New York sent over 2,500 teachers and college students to freedom schools to educate black and white children. Many of the Queen students were black and came down to the South to provide education to other blacks. So, what made freedom schools so different? The black students enrolled in freedom schools learned about black history and political history. They also learned about African dances and African cultures. They learned about black writers and artists and even Dr. Seuss. Many of the freedom schools were meant to make sure that black students were able to keep up with the white students, but it gave them a chance to get ahead of them. So when schools opened back up, they had so much education at their fingertips and they were well read, well spoken, and they understood a lot of concepts. What also made freedom schools stand out to me is the fact that a lot of black students weren't there because they had to be. A lot of them chose to go to freedom schools because they didn't like the reaction that whites gave to desegregation. They didn't understand the reason on going to school with white people if they didn't even want them there. So freedom schools gave them the opportunity to get the education that they wanted around people who actually wanted to educate and be around them. Freedom schools gave black people the opportunity to educate themselves on their own terms by choice. The impact of freedom schools on black students. Many black students in the freedom schools had never been to school at all, and they needed to start at the beginning. The girl students in particular did not know ABCs, reading, adding, or subtracting. Many of the boy students, however, did know how to read, ABCs, add, and subtract, or at least the basics of things. White educators were known to be very careful with their black students because they weren't used to white teachers and they had faced a big wave of hatred after the desegregation laws passed. Many of the black students didn't even think that white educators would take the time to educate them. Black children were not the only students that got to attend these freedom schools. A lot of the freedom schools offered education to black seniors in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were known to want to learn as much as the children did. The freedom schools of the summer offered education to all ages, and because of that, many of the black seniors who didn't get an opportunity to learn in their time period were able to educate themselves with the help of many other scholars. Many black seniors were able to read, write, and do basic math skills after educating themselves at freedom schools. Although it lasted for a short period of time, freedom schools served as a great impact on black education. Many black scholars returned to their desegregated schools prepared for their white counterparts and asking questions as to why black history isn't being taught in schools. Many of them were so used to freedom schools teaching black culture and history, they professed that it should be normalized for black education to be taught. Freedom schools still serve as a big impact on history. 60 years later, later, many freedom schools are still here today, now targeting minority Black students and Mexican immigrants. Continuing the education of marginalized societies and communities that are vulnerable is honorable and essential for great change.